my name's Simon Jackman, and I teach at Stanford University. I wear a few other hats as well. One of them is as one of the principal investigators of the American National Election Studies. That's a job that Skip Lupia, our speaker this afternoon, had ahead of me at Michigan, ANES being a co-production of Stanford and Michigan at the moment. And that's a great way to set up what Skip's going to talk about this afternoon, the public value of social science. Skip is president of the Midwestern Association at the moment. His topics of expertise include information processing, strategic communication, civic competence, and he's published widely in just about every journal in the discipline. As I just said, he's served as head of ANES, just one of the many important jobs that Skip has had in the profession, in the association. And he's helped many public and private sector organizations evaluate and improve their communication strategies as well. Skip's work has been recognized in various ways, including he's a recipient of the National Academy of Sciences Award for initiatives in research. Skip's also just been extremely active of late, waving the flag on behalf of all of us in DC with policymakers, and he's going to draw on that work, I imagine, right now in the lecture he's about to deliver this afternoon. He's going to be exploring, more specifically, answers to the question, what is the public value of social science research? And indeed, drawing on his work in DC, why it is so valuable that Congress should continue to fund social science. He'll clarify how this work does or does not, that is social science, how it does or does not help citizens and policymakers achieve critical goals for society. So please welcome Skip Lupia. Thanks, Skip.
Thank you. Thanks. It's a great privilege to be with you. Thank you for coming to the Empire series. And it's nice to share a stage with Simon as well, because when I talk about people doing activities of value, I think Simon is a great example of what we can do. He's made both methodological and substantive contributions in the leadership too. So I think it's great to share a stage with you. Before I get started, just to let you know, if you're interested in this topic, tomorrow there are going to be two panels that are related to it. One is on congressional funding, where we'll have Congressman Lipinski and a representative of the National Science Foundation here to talk about that. We'll also have one on public engagement and how to improve it. I don't see Lynn Vavrick now, but I did, and she'll be there, and other people who are doing great things with engagement, so if you're interested in this topic. Today what I want to talk about is simple in a way. It's about you, and it's about me, and about us. It's about what we do and what we love and how we talk about it and what it means to other people, right? So a lot of times if you want to do social science, you want to ask for other people's time, students to take your classes, people to read things. Sometimes it's money that you want, or sometimes it's other forms of support. And the thing I want us to think about today, or at least to raise, is, well, what do they get out of it? The people were asking, what do they get out of what we do? And if we think about that a little bit, what should we do next? And so that's where we're headed. There are a lot of people who today seek the advice of political science. You know that there's a debate about federal funding at the NSF, but if you look at the amount of federally funded social science there, or even federally funded political science, it's arguable that there's more of it, it's more expansive than it has been ever before, because there's a wider range of agencies, the UN, state, the Justice Department, the World Bank, amongst others, who are using social science research to improve their activities. Because there are lots of decision makers in the private and public sector who face complex challenges, topics ranging from security to health and things of that nature, the big questions of our day. They have incentives to try and seek, some of them do, the best available information about how to achieve their missions. And more of them are turning to social science to develop strategy and to evaluate what they're doing. So there are a lot of people in this situation. And even as teachers, when we don't talk about these organizations, we create these students who do great things. One of our students, Dan Lipinski, is in Congress. He's actually on the front lines right now in this question about how much should the National Science Foundation fund the social sciences. Again, we'll hear from him tomorrow. He has a political science PhD from Duke. David Petraeus, right, has a graduate degree from Princeton in international relations. A change in the war in Iraq, the change in strategy that led to the surge that was correlated at least with a decrease in sectarian violence in Baghdad, came from an idea about the surge, which itself has its foundations in his doctoral dissertation. Again, this is the types of things we do in political science. We also have some master's students, people who've gotten masters in this discipline, who have gone on to have very powerful positions in the government. And apparently some of our undergraduates have done quite well. Also have been very influential. I don't know what happened to him right now, but apparently he's gone on to great things. So anyways, there's a lot of value that we provide. Okay. And it's not just these people, right? I mean, I don't know how many of you had the privilege of meeting Lynn Ostrom, but probably a lot of you have met her, have read her work. And it hasn't just influenced generations of our students, it's influenced governments and NGOs around the world in terms of how they provide a range of basic services that are critical to the quality of life of millions of people. And again, that's coming out of political science. It got the Nobel Prize in economics, sorry, that's one, but the magnitude of the effect that Professor Ostrom had was just incredible. And again, this is the type of value that we can provide. And at the same time, important questions are being raised, right? So in Washington that there's a question, should we fund social science at all? Why would we do that when maybe we're taking money from cancer research or from science, technology, and engineering? Why would we fund political science when we could give more money to those activities? And that's a question that's out there. My philosophy with respect to this is I don't take these questions as an attack, right? I take these questions as, particularly if we're asking for support, I'd like to have an answer. I think we have answers, and the question is how do we give them? How do we tell our story? And so it's with these types of challenges in mind that I'd like us to think about two things. Right? So the first one is, what is the public value of social science research? I'll talk about political science some, but I like to make it more expansive, right? Because a lot of us are interdisciplinary, right? So that's fine. So what is the public value of it? And then the second question is, if we found it valuable, should Congress fund it? And those aren't necessarily the same thing. There could be great value that is derived from what we do, and yet somebody might make a reasonable argument but Congress shouldn't fund it. So we'll work on both of those questions. With respect to value, so where does the public value of social science research come from? And the way that I like to think about it is put myself in the shoes of a decision maker. Could be, a member of the government, could be a high-ranking official, could be someone in a faith-based organization or a community organization or something who's trying to create value or trying to, provide opportunities or things for people, for real people. And so they have this question, right? The decisions that they make often rely on evaluations, right? You're trying to make sense of the past, right? So when you and I make a plan, when you and I try to do something for someone else, what's the basis of our beliefs about how it will work? Well, the only tangible thing we have is the past. And so the question is, how do we interpret the past? How do we use the past to inform the present and make anticipations about the future? Now, the nice thing about humans, about us, is we have pretty creative imaginations. And so you give us a little bit of data and we can run with it. We can come up with all types of conclusions. Now, a lot of times they're self-serving and inaccurate, but we seem to have no limit in our ability to create these things. And so that can create a problem. Because if you think about government decision makers and they're trying to come up with the best evaluations possible, if you're in DC, you have a lot to choose from, right? So when the economic numbers come out at the beginning of the month, like if you remember during the campaign, we'd hear that the unemployment rate was 7.8%. And the Romney campaign would tell you that's evidence that the stimulus was a complete failure. And the Obama campaign would tell you that's evidence that the stimulus is working, right? No one disagrees on what the number was, but how we evaluate that to affect our current actions and future expectations is very different. We can also look at, in Congress, you can take a single event, like again, job numbers or, our role in Syria or a lack of a role in Syria, and we might agree that there's something happening in Syria or there's something happening in Crimea, but how it's evaluated, how we interpret that event, it can vary widely, right? And politics isn't the only source of this variance. We also have it in the media, right? And for someone my age, in our lifetime, the promulgation of media outlets that specialize with respect to topic or ideology has just blossomed. So there's no shortage of people who will tell me how I ought to interpret the past, right? And that's true of a lot of decision makers. But if you're trying to create value for a family or a community or a nation, the question is, what should you believe, right? Which of these evaluations should we believe? And so this is where science, I think, can play an interesting role, right? Lots of people make knowledge claims. Lots of people make claims about what we should believe. Why should someone listen to a scientist, a social scientist, instead of someone else? Okay. So let me put forward some criteria about how many people, particularly those who are outcome-oriented, evaluate knowledge claims, right? One is credibility, right? So you make a claim, and what I'm trying to think about is, why should I believe this? Is this trustworthy? And I might think about your motives, or I might think about, why you have chosen to say this thing or do this thing. And what I want to know is, are you credible? Another thing that I might think about is legitimacy, right? And I separate these two things. Legitimacy is, how did you come up with this? So maybe independent of your motive, or maybe they're correlated, what were the methods that you used to produce this inference, to make this claim? Are they transparent to me? Are they accessible to me? Or did you come up with these claims by some means that I have no access to? Maybe you appeal to metaphysics or something like that, and I just have to, now I have to go back to trust. But credibility and legitimacy are two things that many outcome-oriented people look for when figuring out what they should believe. So that brings social science, right? What is the value, the public value of social science research? And my answer is, it's a possible source for credible and legitimate evaluations. Not the only one, but it has some interesting advantages, okay? So when I'm old enough that when I was a graduate student, I actually got to meet Richard Feynman. Okay, his energy was incredible, so he was a great guy. And one of his big themes, and this is from his Caltech commencement address in 1974, was about the public value of transparency. Okay, so what he said is scientific integrity corresponds to a type of utter honesty, a sort of leaning over backwards, right? What are we leaning over about? We want to try and help people judge the value of our information. When I think about the public value of science or its potential, I think about it as a bet, right? I think about going in front of people and saying, I'm willing to double down on transparency. I'm not only going to make a knowledge claim, but I'm willing to share with you how I selected my cases and how I made inferences from these cases, how I decided to pay attention to some more than others, how I tried to enumerate an abstract concept or not. But in science, the play is not that I have numbers, at least from my perspective. The move is that I'm willing to double down on transparency. So if we have a debate about things, I don't have to be right, but my legitimacy play is I'm going to tell you how I did it. With the idea is, if you did exactly what I did, I think you'd come to the same conclusion. And so we could both be wrong, but at least, what you don't have to do is somehow say, well, that's just special to skip, right? And so this makes the knowledge maybe accessible and relevant to you. Okay. So that's the upside. There's a temptation, when you're in a knowledge claim, particularly when you care about people listening to you, is that you want to cherry pick what you talk about, right? You just want to say the good parts of your story. You don't want to tell them that, if you tweak this variable or you sort of omit this, that the answer might be different. Okay, and I can understand why people do that, but in terms of the possible comparative advantage that we have as scientists have in the public sphere, I think transparency in a sense is our biggest play. It's the thing that might distinguish us from other really great knowledge communities, but it's where our value might come from. Okay, in the social sciences, there's been an increasing emphasis on transparency. In psychology, there's the Reproducibility Project, which is really transforming research in that discipline. In our discipline, the APSA Council has adopted changes to its ethics guide under the rubric of DART, that's Data Access and Research Transparency. And it's really kind of a set of norms that we might enforce or at least talk about with each other about sources, things we can do that affect the credibility and the legitimacy of our work, regardless of method, regardless of topic. Right? Those principles would be data access, and sometimes I can share my data with you, or in other cases I can just say, well, here's how I selected the cases, and if you do too, that's open to you. And the other is research transparency, right? So research transparency has two elements here. One is production transparency. How did I generate a case or a data or a survey or things of that nature? And then once I have some evidence, some observations, how did I analyze them? How did I interpret what I have and try and turn it into a knowledge claim? Right? So people can make knowledge claims, but I think what science gives us the ability to do is to double down on transparency in this domain. And ultimately, this is a claim that I'll make. I think this is our main source of legitimacy and perhaps our comparative advantage in the public sphere. So when we talk about the value of social science research, I really think the emphasis is on credible and legitimate evaluations. It's a potential source for that. All right. So there are lots of issues, right, where we make decisions. And the question is, how should we go forward, right? When you think about military operations, when you think about trying to provide health care, these aren't just abstractions. We're making decisions that affect real-life outcomes for individuals. And so the question becomes, if we're on the front lines, whether it's as a doctor or as a soldier, what's the theory we're going to operate on as to whether we turn left or turn right, whether we stop or go forward? Do we want to base it on things that make us feel good, on sort of folk theories, or would we like to base it on maybe the best available logic and evidence, where availability is a key, right? We're all imperfect, but science might give us the ability to think about that. So if we're transparent and honest about how we've done things, I think we have an opportunity. So let me put Baghdad in front of you. So I mentioned earlier that there was a change in the military strategy in Baghdad about 3 years in, and the idea was to send a lot more soldiers into Baghdad. Okay, so a refresher on the history. There was, the U.S. military invaded Baghdad. Saddam Hussein fell very quickly, and there was the hope that Iraq would transition the way that it governed itself. And the hope was that it would happen very quickly. But of course it didn't. And what happened, along with the lack of a speedy government transformation, was there was a large increase in violence. Okay, not just violence against military targets, but sectarian violence. Residents of Baghdad, citizens of Iraq attacking one another. Okay? So the following facts about Iraq are indisputable, and I'm drawing largely from a paper that I think is very interesting. This is from Nils Weidman and Idian Salayan in International Studies Quarterly about this. So this is a piece of research that I've used that's also been used by decision makers. So it's an example that I present to you. So the following I would assert are at least not controversial. In Baghdad from 2003 to 2008, there was a spike in conflict. There are very good records, right, of violent acts committed in the city of Baghdad. Okay? We also know that there was a surge. We can count the number of soldiers that were there, and there's no debate that increased. There's also no debate that soon after the soldiers were there, violence in Baghdad declined precipitously. Okay? So that's without debate. But now the question going forward in terms of, was this a good thing to do? I mean, should we regard this as a success or not? There's a debate. And if you're an undergrad, I don't know if they're young, this is the correlation causality thing, but here's how it plays out. Okay? There are at least two explanations for why we saw less violence towards the end of this period. One is that what the surge did is it detected insurgents, people who were causing violent acts, and took them out of circulation, sometimes by killing, sometimes by imprisoning them. But that one idea is that the surge did this. The other hypothesis is that the surge was just correlated with another event, and that was ethnic unmixing. That is, a lot of the violence in Baghdad was between Sunnis and Shias, one group attacking the other. And the counterclaim is that the surge just happened to be going on at the same time as the ethnic unmixing. All right, so let's think about this in a little more detail, and I'll show you how social science comes in. Okay, so what Weidman and Salayan did is they accumulated data from a number of different sources, okay? They have data, very detailed data on the ethnic composition of neighborhoods, okay? What type of religious background in particular people had. They also had changes in settlement patterns over time. So maybe every quarter they had a sense of who was living where. All right. Also violence. So there were reports of violence, and you could take those reports and geocode them and also temporally code them. So an attack happened in this neighborhood at that time. Okay. and the date of violence. So that's going to be the evidentiary basis for some inquiries about, was it the surge or was it something else? Okay? So here's some maps, just to give you a sense. I'm sorry the images aren't great, but here's a question. We live in a society where a lot of people have means, average incomes are high. Residential mobility is, I don't know what it is in a given year. I can't remember the stat, like how many people move within a year. I don't know if it's 8% or something, or over 5 years, if it's 10% or 20%. But as you get into a society where the incomes are lower, it's harder to move. And for cultural reasons, people don't want to move. The reason I'm putting that out there is this is a map of Baghdad. And what you're seeing is an 18-month difference between the top column and the bottom column in where different ethnic groups live. Black is, let's see, gray is Shia. I guess you can't really, gray is Shia, and the black is Sunni. In an 18-month period, there is massive movements across and within this city by members of ethnic groups. This is 18 months. You have huge groups of people uprooting homes where they've lived maybe for generations and moving. Okay? So there's clearly a lot of movement going on in a very short period of time that's commensurate with the surge. All right. So the method that these authors use, and again, this is using some social science methods that I think a lot of us are familiar with, a variant of it. All the data is geocoded. Right? So I know I talked to you, you're doing GIS, are you? Yeah, so there are people doing sort of GIS, trying to take not just information about an event, but to locate it geographically. So all the data is geocoded, and what they were able to do through a series of computational models was try to evaluate millions of possible patterns between where ethnics live, their physical location, the time of attacks, and where they happen. So the neat thing about some of the things we do is you can actually try to recreate or simulate millions of different possibilities, right? So what you can do is now try and use these patterns to simulate or derive estimates about, okay, well, if you were to send more officers into a place, what effect would it have, right? So here are the main findings, right? And again, this can inform the types of decisions that we make. First, almost all of the attacks that were happening in Baghdad through this whole period were Sunni on Shia or Shia on Sunni. Okay, so that's an interesting thing to know. The second thing is that most of the attacks were not on a randomly selected other, it was on one that lived really near you. And if you think about this, this makes sense, right? If you have to travel across town to attack somebody, there's a lot of things that can happen to you on the way there. And if you've attacked somebody, if you've blown something up, people tend to notice, and if you're on the way back and it takes you a while to get there, you might not get back. So most of the attacks are on people who are of a different religion or ethnicity in this case, but very spatially proximate. Okay? The second thing is when there's an attack in your area, people search for safety, right? If your people are attacked, the question is, how do I get away from this? Right? You want to distance yourself from it, right? And so when you see movement, right, the movement is from if you're in a neighborhood where a group has been attacked, you are far more likely to move than if you're not in that category. Okay? So what happens is very quickly, new ethnic enclaves emerged. Whereas before you had Sunnis and Shias living in the same neighborhoods pretty regularly in Baghdad, at the end of this 18-month period, the one that I showed you, very little of that is happening now. Very quickly, people are living amongst their own groups. And so what you can't deny is that ethnic segregation was limiting the violence. But the interesting thing about this topic, when I put the two hypotheses out there, this doesn't have to be either or. So the other finding of the study is about the timing of a surge. And the main conclusion is that if you're going to do a surge, don't wait. Do it early. Because the earlier you do it, the more effect it has. Here's the logic. If your group and my group starts attacking one another, and we're killing each other's families and things like that, we are directing a lot of our personal energy and our social infrastructure to trying to either arm ourselves for an attack or protect from it. And once we've reorganized ourselves in that way, we're ready to go, and we have reasons to attack. We have sort of reorganized our energy to that purpose. So if you wait 2 or 3 years to bring the police in, we're already ready to participate in violence. Whereas if you do that much earlier, the reorganization hasn't happened yet, right? People haven't taken the resources of their society and aimed it towards violence. And so if you bring soldiers in now and try to find ways to keep the peace, all else constant, your job is easier if you've done it early rather than late. And it matters, right? Because people have different opinions on the war in Iraq. But I think that, we send people there. People are sent to do battle. And the question is, when we think about their outcomes and their futures, what do we want it to be based on? Do we want it to be based on sort of self-fulfilling prophecies or hand-waving? Or would we like, if you have relatives, don't we want it to be based on the best available evidence and logic? That's the choice we have. And that's the type of thing that social science does, not just for the military branch, but for a lot of branches of government. In November, the National Academy asked me to run a session inside Congress. And the idea was to talk about the value of social science, but the tagline we used was how social science saves the government money. And it was all about that, right? And trying to think, so it wasn't making a general case for how great we are. It was like, here are 10 examples of things that you want to do where it saves you lots of money. And for that purpose, we had former members of Congress from both parties testifying on our behalf, right? They have choices to make. And when they care about outcomes, the type of work that we can do, it really matters, all right? So the value of a scientific approach, again, is it can be a source of legitimate conclusions. I mean, we can look at the study that I just told you. We can look at the methods and argue about parts of it. That's what we do. But the interesting thing about this case, one of the reasons I like this case, is they're very transparent about how they came up with it, right? And so we can argue about that. And if we're in the social sciences or in the practitioner field, we can have a constructive conversation about whether or not that's worth believing. I'll give you one more example, and then I'll go to the second question. Healthcare. Again, it's one of the defining questions of our era in American politics. Who should get it, who should pay for it, and so forth. Social science has been and is increasingly important in those conversations. I'm just going to give you one example that I know about because I was involved in it pretty early. About 10 years ago, I guess it's 12. Yeah, it's long. The National Science Foundation funded a new infrastructure project called TESS. TESS would allow really anyone with a good idea to propose it, and we built an infrastructure that would run it for you. So the typical thing is a graduate student, a younger faculty, or so forth, would have an idea for an experiment they wanted to run. At the time, most experiments in social sciences were run on college campuses on undergrads. No offense to either population. But sometimes you want to make some inferences where they might not be the most representative subjects. And so what we allowed people to do on TESS is to run experiments on people selected from all over the country through telephone and internet-based survey experiments. So that was the basic idea. Early on in this project, I was approached by a young MD who was working with a lot of people. You'd heard this idea of evidence-based medicine, so they were really interested in that. And they wanted to know how they could better serve their patients, not just individual patients, but communities of patients. And he'd heard about TESS and wondered, he had an idea for different ways of trying to present medical information. So here's the idea that he had. Vaccines matter. If you can give a population vaccines, there's all kinds of health outcomes and monetary outcomes that are bad that you can avoid later if you vaccinate a population. We have a vaccine controversy, but the other thing we have is new vaccines are constantly coming online. Not every day, but maybe a couple a year or 2 every 3 years or something like that. Now, there is an interesting problem. Most people in this room, because I think we're pretty privileged, we probably have health provided by our employer. Right? And so the way that happens is your employer actually writes a contract with an insurance company, a health provision company. And what they do when they write this contract is they agree to certain fees in exchange for providing you with certain types of services. Not everything, but here's a set of things that we'll cover. Now, if you think about the vaccine world, suppose that your company signs a contract with a health insurer, and then a vaccine that you might need comes online. At the time this study was run, that vaccine was not covered by your insurance company. You had to wait for it to be renegotiated at another time to come in. If that vaccine is important, right, if that vaccine can sort of help a population, that could be a difficult thing, particularly if people are reticent to pay out of pocket for those things, but might take advantage of it if it was provided as part of their insurance. So this was the question. Would people pay for a slight alteration for their insurance policy in exchange for having access to any new vaccine that comes in line? So they ran an experiment. So the question is, this experiment had 500 respondents who had children in their home and 500 who didn't have a child in their home. And I'll show you why that matters in a second. But we have 1,000 people from all over the country. So at the time, people had to pay out of pocket for non-covered vaccines. That was the law. And so the question is, would enrollees pay higher premiums for comprehensive coverage? And what I mean by comprehensive here is basically we add an options contract to your health insurance. We say, not only are we going to cover these things, but any vaccine that the CDC approves over the next 24 months or whatever the term, you get that too. So would people pay for that, right? Because the thing we knew is that when these new things came online, they weren't covered and people weren't paying for them. They were actually not getting the vaccine, okay? So the respondents can choose, in this experiment, the respondents can choose a basic health plan, or they can choose this plan that we called with comprehensive coverage. If you were in the individual sample, it would cost you $3 extra a month. If you were in the family sample, it would cost you $6 extra a month. Now, I need to tell you something about the design of this study, okay? You might say, where did the numbers $3 a month and $6 a month come from? The actual amount that would cost your insurance company to provide this benefit to you, the actual amount, you know what it might be? It's 3 to 4 cents per month. Okay? Now you think, how could it be so inexpensive? Well, A, very few vaccines are approved in a 2-year period. B, a vaccine that's approved, you might not need. It might just be for your daughter, or it might just be if you have a certain condition. And if you need the vaccine, you typically only need it once. Some you need 2 or 3 times. You know, so if you think about how much that costs, even if it costs a couple $100, you know, if you do all the conditional probabilities, it's 3 to 4 cents per month. So we tested that, and people stopped the survey, like, why are you asking me this question if I pay 3 cents a month? So the minimum number we could get to run this study is $3 to $6 per month. This is going to become relevant when I show you the results. The results are over 77% of the sample, of each subsample, would pay $3 to $6 per month for an option that has a huge public health benefit that would cost their insurance company 3 to 4 cents per month to provide. Everybody wins, okay? And you can find this. And when you ask the same people, right, you give them would they pay for it out of pocket? Or if you looked at actual practice, fewer than half were taking these same vaccines and using them, right? So this is kind of interesting. This was published in one of the main medical journals, right? And the logic was used to justify the inclusion of this benefit in the Affordable Care Act. This option now is not something that your insurance company negotiates anymore. It's part of the law. But social science, particularly this study by Matt Davis and Catherine Font, got a lot of visibility. And it's this thing, what? You know, they can provide it at low cost, make a little bit of profit, and have a huge public health benefit. But before this study was run, no one knew that that possibility exists. And the way that they figured it out was by applying social science, right? So when you think about medicine, when you think about, you know, there's doctors and patients, and they have decisions to make, and they have ways to talk to patients and things to offer them, what do we want to base those interactions on? You know, bedside manner is really good, but if we can augment the care with the best possible logic and evidence, you can change the quality of people's lives. And so the distance between the type of things that we do and the types of outcomes that people have, in a lot of cases, the gap is not anywhere near as great as you think it is, okay? So that brings me to the final question, which is, should Congress pay for it? And I just want to, I'll be sort of free-flowing in the Q&A, but I have a prepared remark about that because I just want to stay on target, right? So, you know, the key thing is, I think we can all agree that science has an important role in American life, right? Scientific discoveries help individuals with their health. You know, they help farms be more effective. They help us build businesses, right? They help, you know, our defense industry, you know, be more effective. Sometimes it helps them treat people with more compassion, right? I mean, science does all of these things. It's part of the conversation, all right? And so, but should Congress pay for it? And the fact of the matter is that the US Congress, under the Constitution, isn't obligated to spend a single cent on science, not one. If you look at the Constitution and you look for the word science or anything like it, not really in there, right? Certainly not funding science, right? So then the question is, like, why would they do it? Why would they do it? And now let's just talk about social science, because, you know, you all go home after the conferences, or you go to Thanksgiving, you tell people you're a political scientist, and people give you the oxymoron look. Like, how can you do that, right? And so it's not obvious that what we do, you know, has value to a lot of people. So we have to recognize that it looks odd. But what I try to look for is ways to leverage that right? Ways to take that reality and then think about how to tell our story as a means for improving their lives, right? Because ultimately that's what a lot of people care about. You know, we understand that in modern society, how we organize ourselves, how we spend our precious time and resources, right? It depends on evaluations. It depends on what we do with the past. And the opportunity that we have is to give people better access, better ability to make better, maybe not always perfect, but better interpretations of the past that can be legitimated because we're willing to tell people how we did it. Now, the alternative for a lot of decision makers is, you know, you can listen to the media, you can read blogs, and there are a lot of people who tell you how the world works. And that's a great part of the public sphere. But a lot of people want to know how to distinguish the stories that are true or possibly true from the stories that are demonstrably false or at least possibly true. And that's what I think social science is critical in doing. You know, when people talk about homeland security or job creation, you know, you can do that effectively or ineffectively. You can do that efficiently or inefficiently. If you want to do it effectively and efficiently, the proper use of evaluation, the proper use of data is critical. And that's what social science is built to do. So if we want to establish justice and, you know, ensure tranquility and provide for the common defense, you know, these are the things that social science can do. They're great at it, and in a lot of cases, there is no substitute. So for this reason, supporting social science is really critical to any society that wants to achieve its greatest aspirations with increasing effectiveness or efficiency. I'm like a geek, and so one thing I do is actually I read the APSA presidential addresses. One of the favorites that I always maintain is that this is Matthew Holden. He was a president of APSA about 10 years ago. He's written a number of things that are personally inspirational to me. But when he was president of APSA, you know, he gave this thing saying, talking about how other people don't see political science the way that we do, and how, you know, ultimately there's this great discovery element of it. There's the part we love. You know, there's the personal accolades. That's great. But ultimately, if our activities aren't fundamentally about service, fundamentally about service to communities and peoples and others, you know, with respect to their lives and on their terms, then it's difficult for people to walk away saying that, you know, I feel good about supporting you. So my conclusion is, you know, our knowledge base is tremendous and it's expanding, and the interdisciplinarity of it and the range of topics, it's really incredible. Right? If we learn how to tell our stories a little bit better, if we sort of open our eyes and are a little more responsive to what communities need from us, you know, not only can we better recognize the neat things we are doing, but there's the possibility of doing so much more, of creating so much more value. And as those things happen, you know, when Senator Coburn or other people, you know, start a conversation by saying we shouldn't fund that, you know, the possibility that's in front of us is there can be 10 other people in the room saying, look, I have a great example of why this is critical to our social mission. And when we are successful at changing that conversation, then I think the anxiety we may have about funding, it'll take on a different form. So with that, I'll take questions.
Who wants to get us started? Thank you. And if you could you just state your name and perhaps your affiliation as well?
Sure.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Perry Shortshay. I'm from the University of Utah. And first, I just want to thank you, Skip, for your efforts in this attempt to help policymakers understand us better. I'm wondering, though, whether there's any tension in your description about what political science does and some of the parts of our discipline that see themselves critiquing power, critiquing members of Congress, critiquing lobbyists, critiquing the way our democratic system works. And then I would put another layer on that, and then I'll stop, and that is your vision of science one that is built on natural science, or do you see social science as having to be different because people aren't atoms and have culture and self-awareness? And is there room, I don't know if it's a winning argument with Congress, but I'm asking you, is there room for a critical social science or an interpretive social science in these battles, or is that just not going to help us?
Thanks, Perry. Those are great questions. We do have a political issue, right? Which is when we study quarks or leptons or cells, they're not on the National Science Board, they're not on the Science Committee in the House, and so, because they might be pretty ticked off by some of the things we say about them. But when you study Congress, that's a bit of an issue. That's a reality, and the truth is, there's so much value that we can provide to the public in so many ways that, if that becomes the argument or the focus, we're sort of forfeiting an opportunity to do that. So, when I go to Washington, that's out there. I'm happy to take questions about it. But at the end of the day, if Congress decides that they don't want to pay for that, I don't fold up. And I'm like, okay, well, there's like 20 other things we can do for you to help communities and various agencies and things like that. And if that's what you're willing to buy, right, we have a great way to help you do it, right? I mean, would I like to win the Congress? The battle about, do I think that research is useful? I do. But I think just personally, at those moments, I'm kind of pragmatic, because obviously I believe in the role of science in society and sort of, what it can do for individuals' lives. I mean, art for art's sake is fine too, but, and so if there's an opportunity to push that forward, I'll do it. You asked about my view of science, and I revere both the social sciences and the natural sciences, and my definition is kind of simple. It's about, I think it's really about data access and research transparency, and that's available to anyone, right? I mean, this DART project is Colin Ellman and I. I mean, so Colin, I think we had that session last year. So, in this transparency move that we're making in political science, it's this, I think, unprecedented coalition of people who do interpretive work and qualitative work and so forth, and some of them make this argument way better than I do, right? So here's my gambit. If we're willing to talk about case selection, and you describe what your interpretive method is and you lay it out, and so let's say you do it, and then I look at it and say, okay, if I had followed all these things, I'd come up with the same conclusion. For me, that's science, right? For me, that's what it is, right? So, because otherwise I don't know where you draw the line, right? And so that's available. That's available to us, and I think it's a huge asset, right? Because there's an infinite number of ways we could interpret, observations, phenomena, and so forth. Now, granted, for certain types of problems, there are methods of inference that can be more reliable than others. But in terms of where the science, non-science is, I mean, for me, it's not a meaningful thing. I want to provide value to people who need it. And so I want to offer them credibility and legitimacy. I think if you put the science stamp on it and say that it's procedural transparency, that's fine. If you wanted to find it another way, that's fine too. I just want to provide value.
Thank you. My name is Richard Ama from Minnesota State University. I'm originally from Ghana as well. My question is, do you think that political science as a field of study is so vast that we have virtually lost the aspect of analyzing the scientific aspect? My second question is, do you think that we should limit the scientific analysis to specific areas of the subject and not necessarily trying to quantify almost the whole subject area?
I'm going to give you an honest answer, which is not the one you're expecting. In terms of my training, most of what I learned in graduate school is math. I had a Celtic PhD, and so that's kind of where I come from. And the other thing is I grew up on a farm, in a pretty small, one stoplight town. And so when I think about what science could be or should be, what I want to do is try and find ways to, maybe not solve problems, but help people reduce their uncertainty about things, help them from drawing incorrect conclusions, and help them make better decisions. That's like my motivation. And for me, anybody who wants to do that, I'm happy to help them. The reason I'm saying that is because for me, where the boundaries of political science are, like what's in it and what's not, I don't care. I have friends and networks, I'm sure you do too. I learn so much from people from other disciplines, and that's kind of what I'm interested. I'm like, not everyone, I'm not saying if you don't see it this way, it's wrong, but I'm kind of problem-oriented and solution-oriented, and almost, you know, if there are 5 people in a room and some of them have a background in psychology and others in sociology and others in, you know, sort of interpretive methods or whatever, you know, if that's how we figure it out, that's fine. If we want to call it political science, that's fine. Now, I will say, in terms of engagement, I am happy to call myself a political scientist, and I do it in every venue I go to. I mean, I don't know if you're happy with me doing that, but you know, and to the extent that things that I do or Simon does or something like that, to the extent that they help the brand, that somebody walks out of a room with us and they're like, oh, political science is sort of interesting. If you want to study something and you call yourself a political scientist, if we leave that legacy in the room, it helps you. And so I think, you know, I wouldn't want to limit anybody as long as what, you know, they're committed to transparency, right? So that's why I wouldn't want to draw a border around it, right? I mean, if you want to talk about politics and you don't want to be transparent, then I'd have a little trouble with that. So you know, here I'm going to get myself into trouble, but you know, unnecessarily. So Nate Silver's a wonderful public figure, right? And he's brought a lot of interest to things. But to the best of my knowledge, he doesn't release his methods. Like, you can't tell what model he's using or if he's changing it from day to day. And so I enjoy what he does. I'm not, you know, there's a scientific element to it, right? Because, I mean, he's using methods and things like that. But, you know, my reliance on his knowledge claims is sort of limited by the fact that I don't actually know what his methods are. And so I'd have trouble vouching for him, right? So I know whether that's science or not, but that's the type of thing where I'm not sure. Like, I want to, you know, I like numbers, so. But.
Sure.
Hi, Phil Howe, Adrian College. Do you feel like public attitudes towards social science in general are becoming more positive over time? And kind of as a related point, do you think people like Nate Silver, I agree completely in your assessment of it, but do you think people like him, or things like the Loki Cave, various other websites like that, are playing a role in making people just more sympathetic with what we did?
Yeah, so here's what I'll say. I mean, in terms of the general public, I think most people don't have a concept of what social science is. They have a good idea like what psychology is. They have a good idea what economics is. And I think a growing number know what political science is. But I think, you know, in terms of their lives, they want people to answer their questions. And so, you know, Nate Silver, in terms of like enrollments in my classes, that's great. You know, because people like want to know more about polls, and I think that's, and the attention that he's brought to numeracy, I think is really fascinating. So I mean, I wanted to, you know, I want to box that in the, I would like to know more about his methods for my own purposes, but I think in terms of, for a lot of us, the attention he brings is fantastic. But I will tell you this, like when all the Coburn stuff happened, I have just finished my term as head of the social sciences at the AAAS, they're the ones that make science, and I'm on the advisory board for the behavioral and social sciences at the National Academy. So, you know, these are great organizations who can tell the story about science. And so as, you know, I was talking to people, trying to be helpful and things of that nature, I had access to a lot of documents about the previous times that this thing played out. Because this is not the first time that people have questioned. So in 1984, I think that's the year, the political science, if somebody's old enough, I think it's the year, the political science line item at NSF was actually zeroed out in a budget. So I think there was 1 year with a zero budget. I don't know if anybody can remember that, but I think that's the year. So I asked people, I talked to people. Ken Prewood was a great source for me. I asked him about the battles in the 80s and the 90s. And so in the 80s, when this happened, a lot of people in the natural sciences were like, you know, that's happening to them. And what happened this time is I didn't hear a single counterexample in either of those agencies. They all said it's happening to us. It's happening to us. So there is, and this, I've seen this in my sort of academic career. You know, within those communities, within the natural sciences, the idea that the social science are part of what they do, it has a lot more acceptance. I'm not going to tell you it's 100%, right? But there's a lot more acceptance of it. And so that's been a big change. And that was huge in what happened in Washington the last year. There was a week in May where on Monday, President Obama went to the National Academy of Science. I don't know if you know this. And in talking about the great things that the National Academy did, mentioned political science explicitly and its value to the nation, right? And then a couple days later, John Holdren, the nation's science advisor, talked about the same topic and went on about it for a while. So, you know, both of those narratives were not in the context of, you know, sealing off the social sciences. They were on the critical importance of science to the nation, right? So nobody was drawing lines there. And I think that's, you know, it's N equals 2, but I think it's representative of a bigger movement.
I'm Erin McAdams from Presbyterian College, and I also wanted to thank you for your work in raising the value and importance of what we do to policymakers. But I think that this conversation also has the added benefit of us reflecting on what we do, and it seems that your prescription is more than just we need to remarket what we already do so others see the value of it. I wonder, are there other prescriptions that you have for how we practice political science as a discipline? The things that we encourage our graduate students to do, the things that we perhaps value most from, you know, in terms of getting tenure and that type of thing, so that we're producing the type of work that is of more value.
So thank you for asking that. In my other life, I work a lot with you know, various groups on how to communicate science, particularly in politicized environments. And I love us, but as a general matter, none of us are trained in that. You know, we're trained at best in how to talk to our colleagues or people in our peer groups, and those stories just don't fly when a lot of times we go to bigger groups. So it's something we can learn, right? It's something, but it's not rewarded, particularly, you know, in a lot of cases if you're a junior person. So here's a couple things that I'll say. It would be helpful if incentives for like, you know, tenure and promotion, if we could find ways to somehow codify people who are doing public engagement and really changing things and really sort of helping things like that. In the UK, there are national evaluations of universities that happen every 6 years, right, on which funding decisions are made. They have now made public engagement 20% of the calculation, right? So funding levels of let's say $500,000 per year depend on whether you can show that as part of your peer-reviewed science, it's also having an impact. So it started a bit of an arms race in those universities to do rigorous research that also has a public impact. In terms of what I'd ask people to do is, you know, I want to help anybody who wants to present themselves more effectively. And I think there are ways to do that. What you shouldn't read into what I'm saying is, you know, if people want to do basic research, it's great. And we need that, right? This is going to be at the core of my talk tomorrow, so like, don't listen if you don't. But, you know, here's my Apple, right? We all love Apple. Okay, Apple has 80,000 employees, right? And they've made iconic products for the last decade. Okay, and we all have a sense of what Apple is. Very few of those employees make anything we would recognize. Many of those employees work on technologies that never see the light of day. Right? Many of those, you know, they work on problems, technical problems, and so forth. Right? It's an amazing part of what Apple is, both in the technical design and the customer service elements. But there's a structure, there's an organization that at some point, you know, people have incentives to be part of bigger conversations, and everybody knows that there's a flow that at some point goes to deliverables, right? So you can do a lot of amazing basic research, but if you're asking Apple to support it, right, at some point you have to make the link about, you know, here's why this amazing basic question that only 6 people can read, you know, might be important to what we do. I think we could do better at that, but I'm not sure that precludes much of what we do. And again, you know, my background has a lot to do with math and statistics, and so, you know, is everything we do like the most constructive? Maybe not, but I wouldn't want to put some sort of limit on that. I mean, what I would want to do, particularly if we're asking for federal funding, is make it really clear about why this is maybe the, you know, I think it's a legitimate question to sort of say to, you know, Congressman Coburn, or I'm sorry, Senator Coburn or somebody else like that, here is why you might want to consider spending, you know, some amount of money on social science rather than on STEM. And I love STEM, but here's why you might want to augment it on that. That's a conversation I'm actually willing to have. And so to the extent that all of us are able to link our work to those stories makes it better, particularly if we can attach it to deliverables where real people's lives are improved. So that's how I think about it.
Michael Bettrand, Syracuse University. I was wondering if you could tie in this idea that social science value added is the credibility and legitimacy of knowledge claims with sort of the anti-intellectualism that seems to be pervasive in our culture, especially with the rise of new, more partisan media situations. How can we as social scientists either interface with that, or is framing our work in terms of credible knowledge claims the best way in light of sort of that trend in our society?
Let me answer that in two ways. I mean, the first thing is, when I talk about engagement, when I get into that, I have one rule. And that is, I am not asking anyone to dumb down anything. Okay? What I'm asking us to do is to smarten up about how we talk to people and what they can hear and what they remember. Because ultimately, if what we're trying to do is communicate science, that outcome matters, right? And we can sort of live in a world where we think our ideas are so important that it's up to the other person to do the interpretation and get it right, right? And it's kind of not how it works. And so, you know, but key one is if we give up the source of legitimacy that we have, which again I would argue starts, and it doesn't start and end, but it starts with procedural transparency and access to at least the data or how we selected cases or things like that. If we give that up, then we've lost our comparative advantages. So that's point one. And I think that, you know, with respect to partisan media, they have some basis for the knowledge claims they make as well. And so there are some people who within their lives, you know, it's really important to just, you know, to hear reaffirmations of the ideological commitments they've already had, and we're not going to win those debates. Right? And that's fine. But there are people who care about effectiveness and efficiency, and there are cases where we might really be able to help them. But the other thing that I'll say is sometimes we don't think a lot. It's tough when you're young. When you're a young scholar and you have this existential question like, do I belong here? Will I get tenure? Am I really good enough to do this? And so forth. A lot of the effort is in trying to demonstrate that. And, you know, we all went through it. But ultimately, most people who you talk to don't care a lot about that, right? What they care about is, can you sort of help them advance their aspirations and put forth, you know, deal with their fears or their problems or things. That's ultimately the talks you remember, the papers you remember are the ones that do that. And so we can stay true to the science, but try and tap into why are you in the room. And so if I'm a conservative and I have a bunch of liberals in the room, if I start by saying that, game over, because people are going to be counter-arguing it. But if I start by talking about a common problem or a common set of values that we have, and I walk through how we can solve the problem, you know, and I provide value to you. So my thing is not about how smart I am or wonderful I am, it's about me serving you and me using science to serve you. That's the way I can communicate the same idea and have it happen. And so there are partisan conversations that we can enter without sacrificing what we do. But again, none of us are trained in that, and sometimes we're like averse to it. But I think, you know, if most people in the social sciences identify as liberals, and so, you know, you want to just talk to liberals, great, you help them out, that's fine. But there are ways, I think, to talk to broader communities and to maintain total integrity with your own belief system and what you do, and it's by finding common ground.
Okay, so at this point I think we might wrap it up. If you could join me in thanking Skip. And I hope I'll hand it back to Skip. He's going to plug these panels that are coming up one more time tomorrow.
Yeah. Before I do that, I want to thank you for coming here. This Empire series, if this is the first session you've attended, it's a new thing we're doing at the MPSA. We're trying it out. If it's something that you'd like to see more of, not me necessarily, but if you'd like to see more of this type of format, please let us know. You can tell me or you can write to the association. We're just trying to find another way or a different way to provide kind of an experience or value or something that you can sort of take with you and that's different than the panels, that complements what we do here. If you like it, please let us know, because I think there's an option to do more of it. If you don't, tell us that, because, you know, that'd be pretty easy to do that. If you want to have us change it, you know, we're open to that as well. And then again, if you're interested in this topic tomorrow at 10:30, I think it is, we're going to have the panel with Congressman Lipinski, a representative NSF. COSA's new president's going to be there, and I think they're going to drop a lot of knowledge on the current aspect, on the current situation. And then we're going to do a great panel on public engagement later with Jeff Isaac, Mark Lynch, who writes for foreign policy. Lynn Babrick's going to be there, and it's Roger Smith. And they have some amazing ideas that we can really implement right now on how to communicate better. But again, thank you to Simon and thanks to all of you for supporting this organization and for coming to the Empire Series. Thank you.